Do you remember the voice they played on the television? For a few weeks in 1979, you could pick up a telephone anywhere in Britain, dial a number for nothing, and hear a man say, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me." It went out on the news. It went out over the loudspeakers at football grounds and across shopping centres on a Saturday afternoon. If you were in this country that summer, you heard him, and almost everything the police believed that voice was telling them was wrong. In the summer of 1979, the police in West Yorkshire did something no force had done before or has done since. They took the recorded voice of a man they believed to be a serial killer, and they played it to the public. Not once and not quietly. They played it on television, they played it over loudspeakers in shopping centres and at football grounds, and they put it on a freephone line so that anyone in Britain could dial a number and listen to it in their own home. The reasoning was simple enough. Somebody somewhere had to know that voice. A brother, a landlord, a foreman, a woman who had once served him in a pub. The inquiry had run for 4 years and had produced nothing but paper, and here at last was something a member of the public could actually recognize. It was, on its own terms, an entirely rational thing to do. The voice belonged to a man who had never killed anybody. The tape arrived at Wakefield in June 1979 in a plain envelope addressed to the officer leading the investigation. Inside was a cassette. On it, a man with a northeastern accent speaks for a little under 4 minutes, addressing the detective by his first name, mocking him, and promising to kill again. Everything about it, the timing, the postmark, the address on the envelope, the details it seemed to know, pointed at the man the whole of the north of England was looking for. The recording opens without preamble. There is a hiss of tape, a breath, and then a level, unhurried voice that says, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me." It goes on in that register, patient rather than frenzied, for the length of a pop song. It does not shout. That was part of what made it convincing to the people who heard it first. It did not sound like a performance, and it did not sound like a crank. It sounded like a man who was in no hurry at all. George Oldfield had been running the inquiry for 3 years by the time the cassette landed on his desk. He was an assistant chief constable of West Yorkshire Police, a man of considerable local standing and near total commitment to the case, and by 1979 the case had begun to consume him in a way his colleagues could see and could not stop. He had already suffered 1 heart attack under the strain. When the tape came, he believed it. He believed it publicly, forcefully, and for a long time after other people had begun to doubt. 13 women had been killed by then, across Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, Halifax and Manchester over a period of 4 years. This is not a video about those killings, and it will not dwell on them. What matters here is the shape of the inquiry that surrounded them, because that shape is the thing this story is actually about. 13 deaths had produced the largest criminal investigation ever mounted in Britain, and that investigation was, by the summer of 1979, drowning. It is worth understanding what drowning meant physically in 1979. There were no databases. Every statement, every tip, every vehicle sighting, every name given by every member of the public was typed and filed as a card or a sheet in a central index at Millgarth Police Station in Leeds. Cross-referencing was done by a human being walking to a drawer, pulling a card, reading it, and remembering what they had read the week before. The floor of the incident room had to be strengthened. That is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration for effect. The accumulated weight of the paper generated by the inquiry became a structural problem for the building that housed it, and the floor was reinforced to carry it. The index had reached a size at which no person, and no group of persons, could hold its contents in their head. It had become an archive of everything the inquiry knew, arranged in a form that made knowing it impossible. That is the condition into which the tape arrived. A vast, exhausted, paper-bound investigation with no way to see itself, and then a single object that seemed to speak directly to the man in charge, by name. 3 letters had come before the tape. The first 2 arrived in 1978, the third in the following year, all posted from Sunderland, all in the same hand, all claiming responsibility. They were taunting in the same style as the recording, and they contained the same mixture of bravado and specificity. When forensic scientists examined the gum on the envelope flaps, they were able to recover enough saliva to determine the sender's blood group, and the group they found was a relatively uncommon one. It appeared to match a grouping recovered from one of the murder scenes. That single apparent correspondence did an enormous amount of damage, and it is worth being precise about why. It was not fabricated, and it was not incompetently obtained. It was a genuine laboratory result correctly reported. What it could not tell anybody was how many other men in the north of England shared that blood group, which was, in absolute numbers, a very large population indeed. A rare-sounding match across a country of 50 million people is not a rare event. But inside an inquiry desperate for a thread to pull, a correct result was read as a confirmation, and the letters graduated from possible hoax to probable killer. There was a second link, and it ran through a killing that almost certainly had nothing to do with the case at all. The letters referred to a woman who had been murdered in Preston some years earlier, in a case that had never been formally attributed to the same offender, but had been quietly wondered about. Because the letter writer appeared to know about it, and because the forensic grouping recovered from that scene lined up with the grouping from the envelope gum, the two things propped each other up. The letters proved the Preston case belonged to the series. The Preston case proved the letters were genuine. Neither proposition had any support that did not come from the other. Circular corroboration of that kind is extremely difficult to see from inside. Each individual officer is looking at a real result, obtained properly, that agrees with another real result obtained properly somewhere else. Nobody in the chain is being careless. What has gone wrong is structural. Two uncertain claims have been arranged so that each is treated as the evidence for the other, and the arrangement produces a feeling of confirmation out of nothing but its own shape. So by June 1979, when the cassette was played, the tape did not arrive as an unsupported claim. It arrived as the voice of a man who had already, in the minds of the investigation, been forensically linked to the crimes. Everything that followed from that. The publicity operation built around the recording was without precedent. Posters carrying the letters' handwriting went up across the north. The tape was pressed onto a telephone line that anybody could ring for free, and it was played at halftime at football matches, in shopping precincts, and on national television news. Officers toured towns in the northeast with loudspeaker vans. The whole apparatus was directed at a single objective, getting one man's voice into the ears of everyone who might have heard it before. It worked in the sense that the country listened, millions of people dialed the line. The voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in Britain, imitated in pubs and playgrounds until it stopped being frightening and became a joke, which is its own kind of failure for a piece of police communication. Tens of thousands of names were put forward by members of the public, each one a card, each card a piece of work for an index that was already past the point of usefulness. And the more publicly the inquiry committed to the voice, the more expensive it became to abandon it. This is not a criticism of any individual. It is an observation about what happens when an organization stakes its credibility on a proposition in front of a national audience. Doubt that would have been cheap in February was, by September, institutionally very expensive indeed. The commitment hardened not because the evidence improved, but because it had been said out loud. To understand why a voice could be treated as a map, you have to know something about a piece of British academic work that had nothing to do with crime, and which had been finished, quietly, more than a decade earlier. In the years after the Second World War, a linguist at the University of Leeds named Harold Orton set out to record the traditional dialects of England before they disappeared. Radio, conscription, mass education and internal migration were flattening regional speech at a rate that anybody paying attention could hear, and Orton's judgment was that within 2 generations the older forms would simply be gone. The project he built to catch them was called the Survey of English Dialects. The survey visited 313 localities across England, chosen to be rural, conservative and geographically spread. Fieldworkers went to each one, found the oldest speakers they could, typically farm labourers and craftsmen who had lived their whole lives within a few miles of where they were born, and worked through a questionnaire of more than 1,000 items, recording precisely how each word was pronounced. The method sounds pedantic. It was pedantic, that was the point. What the questionnaire produced was not an impression of how people in a county sounded, but a set of thousands of discrete, comparable data points, the exact vowel used in a particular word, in a particular village, by a particular generation. Plot enough of those on a map, and you get isoglosses, lines marking where one pronunciation gives way to another. They do not follow county boundaries. They follow rivers, old parish edges, coalfields, the roads that people used to walk to work. It is worth being concrete about what one of those lines looks like, because the word isogloss makes the idea sound more abstract than it is. Take any single feature, whether the vowel in a common word is long or short, whether a particular consonant is dropped between vowels, whether an old plural form survives. Ask the question in 300 villages, mark each answer on a map and a boundary appears. Sometimes it wanders. Sometimes it is astonishingly sharp and sits exactly on a river, a moor, or the edge of a coalfield, because those are the things that historically decided who a person married, worked beside and spoke to every day. Stack enough of those boundaries and the map stops being a picture of accents and becomes something closer to a fingerprint of settlement history. Two towns 20 miles apart can share almost everything. Two districts 3 miles apart, separated by water and by 2 centuries of different industry, can differ in a dozen small ways at once. It is the combination that carries the information, not any single feature, which is exactly the same logic that makes a pollen assemblage informative when a single grain is not. There is a fair objection to all of this, and it should be made here rather than left to the end. The survey deliberately recorded the oldest rural speakers it could find. The voice on the tape belonged to a man in his 20s from an industrial district on the edge of a town. Why should a map of 19th century farm speech locate him at all? The answer is that urban northeastern speech did not appear from nowhere. It is what happened to the surrounding rural speech when pits and shipyards concentrated the people who spoke it. The older map is not a description of the new speech, but it is a reliable description of what the new speech is made of, and the regional differences survived the move into the towns better than anybody expected. Stanley Ellis was one of the men who had done that walking. He was a dialectologist at Leeds, a former fieldworker on the survey, and he had personally recorded speakers in a large number of those localities, driving a van fitted out with recording equipment around the north of England for years. He did not learn the map of English speech from a book. He had made a substantial part of it himself, one farmhouse kitchen at a time. When West Yorkshire police wanted to know where the voice on the tape came from, Ellis was, in a literal sense, one of the few people alive who could answer. Jack Windsor Lewis worked the other half of the problem. A phonetician also at Leeds, Windsor Lewis approached the recording as a technical object, which sounds were being produced, how and what set of speech habits they belonged to. Between them, the two men covered both halves of the discipline, the descriptive phonetics of what the mouth was doing, and the geographical distribution of who does that where. Their working assumption was not that an accent identifies a person. It never does, and neither of them claimed it could. The assumption was narrower and much more defensible, that a person's vowel system is laid down in childhood, in a particular place, and that the resulting pattern is difficult to fake and difficult to lose. You can change your vocabulary in a month. You can change your vowels convincingly and under stress almost never. What Ellis produced was not a region and not a city. He listened to the tape repeatedly, isolated the features that mattered, and then did the thing that separates a fieldworker from a theorist. He got in a car and drove to the northeast to listen to people talk. Wearside speech is not Tyneside speech, though people outside the northeast habitually treat them as one accent. Sunderland and Newcastle sit 12 miles apart and differ audibly to anyone raised in either. Within Wearside, the older speech varied again from district to district, and the tape speaker used a set of features that, taken together, belonged to a small area on the north side of the river. His conclusion was narrower than anything the inquiry had asked for. The speaker was raised in Castletown on the north bank of the Wear. Not Sunderland generally, Castletown, a district of a few thousand people, formerly a pit village, absorbed into the town but linguistically still distinct. Ellis was prepared to put that in writing, and did. He did not arrive at that by intuition. He went to the northeast and recorded people in the ordinary way of his trade, find speakers who have not moved, get them talking about work and childhood until they stop performing for the microphone, and compare what comes out with the questioned recording feature by feature. He listened in Newcastle and ruled it out. He listened along the Wear and narrowed it. He crossed to the North Bank and found the combination he was looking for still being produced by men who had never left. The features themselves are unglamorous when written down, the quality of a handful of vowels, the treatment of certain consonants between vowels, the survival of one or two older forms that Sunderland kept and Newcastle did not. Individually, none of them would place anybody. Together, in that particular arrangement, they belonged to a small area with a specific industrial history, and Ellis had spent enough of his life in that arrangement to recognize it the way a birdwatcher recognizes a call. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of work. A man had spoken for under 4 minutes into a cassette recorder, and an academic listening to a copy had placed his upbringing within an area you could walk across in 20 minutes. It was also, in the end, completely useless, and the reason it was useless is the actual subject of this story. Because Ellis said something else, and it was not written down with the same prominence. Having listened to the tape as closely as anyone alive, he formed the view that the man speaking on it was probably not the killer. He said so. His doubt was not phonetic. A voice cannot tell you what its owner has done. It was based on the ordinary judgment of someone who had spent his professional life listening to how people speak when they mean something and when they do not. The delivery struck him as performed, the content struck him as thin. The inquiry took the geography and left the doubt. That is the sentence to hold on to, because it is the mechanism of the entire catastrophe, and it repeats across the history of forensic science with almost tedious regularity. An expert produces two findings, a technical one which is precise and a cautionary one which is not. The organization absorbs the precise finding and discards the caution, because the precise finding is actionable and the caution is merely true. Peter Sutcliffe was a lorry driver from Bradford. He was 33 years old in 1979, married, employed, and living in a detached house in a respectable street in the Heaton district. He had a full beard, he had a West Riding accent, a Yorkshire accent, and specifically not a northeastern one. And he had, by that summer, already been inside the machinery of the inquiry more times than almost anybody else in England. He was interviewed 9 times during the inquiry. 9 separate occasions on which police officers sat in a room with the man they were looking for, asked him questions, wrote down his answers and filed the result. He came to attention through the £5 note traced to a payroll, through vehicle sightings, through the tyre track exercise, through repeated appearance in red light district registration checks. Each time he was seen and eliminated. The routes by which he came to notice are worth listing, because they show how much the inquiry actually had. A new £5 note recovered in connection with one killing was traced back through the banking system to a batch issued to a small number of employers, and from there to a payroll of a few thousand men, among them Sutcliffe, who was interviewed as a result. Tyre impressions from another scene generated a list of vehicles. Repeated sightings of cars in red light districts generated more. He appeared through several of these independently, which is precisely the pattern that a modern system is designed to flag and that a card index cannot. Elimination is the part people get wrong when they hear this story. The officers who interviewed him were not lazy and were not stupid. They were applying criteria that the inquiry had formally adopted, and by the summer of 1979, 2 of those criteria were lethal. The killer had a Wearside accent, the killer's handwriting matched the letters, Sutcliffe had neither. He therefore could not be the man, and the officer in front of him had a written basis for saying so. The failure here is worth stating precisely, because the popular version of it is wrong. The tape did not fail by pointing at an innocent man, it never named anybody, it failed by functioning as a filter. A lead that includes people is an inconvenience, It produces a list, and lists can be worked through. A lead that excludes people is something else entirely, because exclusions are invisible. Nobody audits the men who were let go. There is no queue of them, no backlog, no pile of cards waiting to be actioned. They simply cease to exist as far as the inquiry is concerned, and the inquiry gets faster, and the acceleration feels like progress. The inquiry had checked more than 5 million vehicle registrations by the time it ended, and taken statements from tens of thousands of people. Every one of those was work. Every hour spent on the northeast, and there were a great many, including officers sent to Sunderland and appeals directed at the Wearside public, was an hour not spent on the index at Milgarth, where the name of the actual killer was written on cards in multiple places in the force's own handwriting. That is the shape of the thing. The information required to solve the case was already inside the building. What was missing was any means of finding it, and what the tape did was consume the one resource, attention, that might otherwise have been spent building one. It ended on an ordinary night in Sheffield, in January 1981, and it ended without any forensic science at all. 2 officers on patrol in the red light area, Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Robert Hides, ran a check on a car parked with a woman in it. The number plates did not belong to the vehicle. That was the whole of it, a routine registration check of the kind the inquiry had by then performed 5 million times, done on the right car on the right night. Sutcliffe was arrested for the plates. He asked to relieve himself before being taken in, and in the few unwatched seconds that granted him, hid a hammer and a knife behind an oil storage tank. Sergeant Ring went back to the scene 2 days later, on his own initiative, and found them. Within days, Sutcliffe had confessed at length. He did not sound like the tape. He had never sounded like the tape. The single most publicized piece of evidence in the largest manhunt in British history had described, in accurate and expert detail, the childhood address of a man in Sunderland with no connection to the case whatsoever. The tape collapsed as evidence almost immediately. Within days of the confession, it was obvious to everybody that the voice in the shopping centres had never been connected to any of it, and the letters with it. There was no dramatic unmasking because there was nobody to unmask. The hoaxer simply went on living in Sunderland unremarked for another 24 years, while the object he had posted was quietly reclassified from the central plank of the investigation to an unexplained loose end. George Oldfield did not survive it professionally. He had been moved away from the day-to-day running of the inquiry before the arrest, his health broken by it, and he died a few years later without the case ever having been separated from his name. It is easy from a distance to make him the villain of the story, and it is worth resisting. He was a competent detective who was handed an investigation larger than the systems of his era could carry, who worked himself into hospital over it, and who then made one enormous error of judgment that those same systems had no mechanism for catching. Sir Lawrence Byford was asked to find out what had gone wrong. He was one of Her Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary, and the review he produced in 1981 became the most consequential internal document in modern British policing, a report on a single investigation that ended up rewriting how all of them are run. Much of it stayed unpublished for decades. Its substance leaked into practice long before its text reached the public. The report's finding on the incident room is the part that has lasted. The volume of paper had defeated the system meant to organize it. Not the officers, not the leadership, not the effort, the filing. An index of that size, worked by hand, cannot reliably surface the fact that the same name has appeared in it 11 times for 11 different reasons. The information was retained and could not be retrieved, which for operational purposes is the same as not having it. Byford also addressed the tape and the letters directly, and found that the weight placed on them had been excessive and had distorted the direction of the investigation. It is worth noting what he did not say. He did not say the linguistic work was wrong. It was not wrong. It was, as far as anyone can tell, exactly right. The direct consequence of the report was a national computer system for major inquiries, built specifically so that a name entering an investigation from 2 different directions would be flagged as the same name. It is used on every major British investigation today. It exists because of a card index that grew heavy enough to threaten a floor. It is a strange kind of legacy. The system's whole purpose is to make a particular sentence impossible. We already had him more than once and did not know it. Everything else it does, indexing, tasking, tracking which action has been allocated to whom, is in service of that one guarantee. A technology built not to discover anything new, but to stop an organization losing what it already holds. The second consequence was procedural rather than technical, and it concerns exactly the object at the center of this story. Modern practice treats unsolicited communications claiming responsibility as unverified until something independent links them to the offense, not as evidence to be disproved, but as a claim with no standing at all until it earns some. That inversion sounds small. It is the difference between a lead that must justify itself and a lead that is believed until it fails, and the second kind is what closes an inquiry's eyes. The envelope was still in a police store in 2005. That is the fact around which the last act of this story turns, and it is a fact about administration rather than science. Somebody at some point decided not to throw away the exhibits from a closed inquiry and kept on deciding it for a quarter of a century. What had changed in the meantime was what could be recovered from them. The gum on an envelope flap in 1979 could yield a blood group. The same gum, examined with the techniques available by the mid-2000s, could yield a DNA profile from the traces of saliva left by a man who had licked it shut and posted it. The exhibit had not improved, the questions that could be asked of it had. The profile was recovered and run against the National DNA database, and it matched a sample taken from a man in Sunderland who had been arrested some time earlier for a minor public order matter, entirely unrelated to anything. That is how the database works, and that is what it is for. He had not been caught. He had been found in a list by a machine because a routine arrest for being drunk had put his profile into a system that a card index could never have been. John Samuel Humble was arrested at his flat in Sunderland in October 2005. He was in his late 40s, an unemployed labourer, an alcoholic, and a man who had lived his entire life within a short distance of the district Stanley Ellis had named in 1979. He had grown up in Castletown. 26 years had passed between the tape and the arrest. Humble admitted it quickly and completely. He had made the recording, written the letters and posted them, and he had done it in the middle of a national panic for reasons he was never able to explain in a way that satisfied anybody, including himself. He told officers he had thought about coming forward and had been too frightened. He had twice in the intervening decades telephoned a police line anonymously to say that the tape was a hoax and had been ignored. He was sentenced to 8 years for perverting the course of justice at Leeds Crown Court in March 2006. The sentencing was not about the tape as an object. It was about what a diverted inquiry costs, and about the fact that the diversion had run through a period in which the man the police were looking for had not stopped. The prosecution did not have to prove he had done any harm to any specific investigation. The offense lies in the interference itself. But the sentencing remarks and the reporting around them made the context plain enough. 2 of the anonymous calls he described making, attempts of a sort to undo it, went nowhere, and that detail says as much about the handling of unsolicited information in the period as the original failure does. A man rang a police line to say the most famous piece of evidence in the country was fake, and the call joined the paper. It is worth noticing what actually caught him because it was not detection in any traditional sense. Nobody recognized the voice, nobody informed. The exhibit survived because of a filing decision, the profile was recovered because the laboratory methods had moved on, and the match happened because an unrelated arrest years earlier had put his DNA into a national index. Every step was administrative. The case was closed by record keeping, which is a fittingly exact inversion of how it was broken in the first place. A dialect map drawn in the 1950s was fine enough to separate one bank of the ware from the other, and when it was applied under pressure to 4 minutes of a stranger's speech, it put him inside the right few streets. 26 years later, a DNA profile confirmed it. That is a remarkable retrospective validation of a technique, and it is almost never mentioned because the technique was on the losing side of the story. Those are the cases worth going back for, the ones where somebody got it right and nobody wanted to hear it. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps us keep making these, and there is a new case every day. And if there is a case you have always wanted looked at properly, leave it in the comments. That is where most of these start. So what is forensic dialectology actually good for, once you strip away the drama of this particular case? The honest answer is narrow, and the narrowness is what makes it usable. It answers one question: where was this speaker raised? Not who are they, not are they lying, not did they do it. Where did they acquire their vowels? That is a question about a person's first 10 years, and the reason it can be answered at all is that the phonological system laid down in childhood is extraordinarily persistent. People move and their vocabulary and intonation drift, and the underlying vowel system generally does not. 2 men were needed to place one voice on that tape, and that is a fair description of the field's ordinary working practice rather than an accident of 1979. One specialist describes what is being produced, the phonetics, another knows the geographical distribution of those features, the dialectology. Very few individuals hold both at a serious level, which is one reason the discipline has stayed small. Its limits are real, and they are not the same limits as the ones that sink other forensic techniques. Dialectology does not suffer from having been invented for courtrooms. Like palynology and like the wood anatomy that broke the Lindbergh case, it existed as an academic discipline with its own purposes, its own literature, and its own quality control long before a police officer ever asked it a question. That matters because a technique with an independent customer gets corrected when it is wrong. What it does lack is a frequency framework. When a dialectologist says a speaker is from a particular district, there is no database that says what proportion of the population would produce that same set of features, in the way that a DNA profile can be assigned a match probability. The conclusion rests on an expert's structured judgment about distributions, and structured judgment, however good, cannot be audited by anybody who does not already have it. It is also important to separate 2 jobs that get confused because they both involve a recording. One is speaker profiling, an unknown voice, and the question of what can be said about the person behind it, where raised, roughly what age, whether a second language is present underneath. That is what Ellis was asked to do, and it is an intelligence product. It narrows a search. It is not, and was never offered as, proof about an individual. The other job is speaker comparison, a recording of an unknown speaker, a recording of a known suspect, and the question of whether they are the same person. That is the courtroom task, and its history is considerably less happy. For a long stretch of the 20th century, it was dominated by a method that claimed a spectrogram could function as a voiceprint, unique to a person in the way a fingerprint is. It could not. The analogy was wrong at the root. A voice is a behavior, not an anatomical pattern, and it changes with health, mood, telephone line, and audience, and the claim was eventually abandoned by the field itself. What replaced it looks quite different. Careful acoustic and auditory analysis by a qualified phonetician, stated as a strength of support for one hypothesis over another, with the limits of the recording made explicit. That is a far more modest product than a voiceprint, and it is the reason the discipline still stands. The techniques that survive are the ones that agreed to say less. There is a second limitation, sharper and more modern. The Survey of English Dialects recorded the speech of people born in the 19th century, in villages, before mass media. The map Ellis used was already historical when he used it. Traditional dialect has continued to erode since, and regional speech in Britain now varies by age and social network as much as by geography. A voice recorded today is a much harder object to place than a voice recorded in 1979, and the resolution of the map has coarsened accordingly. The third limitation is the one that actually mattered here, and it is not a limitation of the science at all. A dialectologist can tell you where a voice grew up. A dialectologist cannot tell you whether the person attached to that voice is telling the truth, and no amount of methodological rigor will ever change that. Ellis knew it, said it, and was heard on the half of his answer that could be acted upon. There is also a question about the decision to broadcast at all, which is more live now than it was then. Publishing a voice, a face, or a partial description invites the entire population to make identifications, and the population will oblige, enthusiastically, in enormous volume, and with a false positive rate nobody measures. Every one of those calls has to be recorded and assessed by somebody. An appeal that generates 50,000 responses has not given an inquiry 50,000 pieces of information. It has given it 50,000 pieces of work, of which the useful fraction may be 0. That arithmetic has not improved with the internet. It has got worse because the cost of generating a plausible-looking lead has fallen to nothing, while the cost of checking one has not fallen at all. The modern version of the freephone line is a clip circulating on a social platform, and it produces the same asymmetry the tape produced, an inquiry that looks busy, feels engaged with the public, and is spending its scarcest resource on material with no established connection to the crime. That asymmetry is the durable lesson, and it is not confined to policing. Expert advice arrives in 2 parts, a finding and its conditions. The finding is quotable, briefable, and fits on a slide. The conditions are hedged, and hedging reads as weakness inside any organization under pressure to act. So the conditions fall off in transmission, usually within 1 or 2 retellings, and what reaches the decision-maker is a confident claim that the expert never made. One more thing about the map is worth saying, because it cuts against the tidy version of this story. Ellis was not consulted as a last resort by a force that had exhausted everything else. He was brought in early and taken seriously, and his answer was acted on within weeks. By the standards of 1979, that is a force behaving well. It identified that a question required a specialist, found the right specialist, and moved on his findings quickly. The failure was not a failure to use expertise. It was a failure to use all of what the expert said, and those are different diseases with different cures. A force that ignores science needs persuading. A force that adopts the convenient half of a scientific answer needs something much harder to build, which is a habit of writing down the conditions attached to a finding and reviewing them when the finding starts doing heavy work. There is one further detail worth sitting with. The reason the hoax worked so well was not that it was clever, it was not clever. Humble was an alcoholic laborer with no criminal sophistication whatsoever, who licked an envelope and left his own saliva on it, which is precisely how he was eventually caught. The hoax worked because the inquiry needed it to be true. 4 years of unanswered work had produced an organization that could not afford another dead end. Into that arrived an object that was vivid, personal, addressed to the man in charge, and apparently corroborated by a laboratory. It did not have to be convincing on its merits, it only had to be the first thing in 4 years that felt like contact. And that, in the end, is the more useful way to read the whole episode. Every element of the failure looks obvious in retrospect, and none of it was stupid at the time. The blood group result was correct. The dialect analysis was correct. The decision to go public was defensible. The exclusion criteria were written down and applied consistently, which is exactly what an inquiry of that size is supposed to do. The catastrophe was assembled entirely out of individually reasonable steps, and that is what makes it worth studying rather than merely deploring. There is a cost to all of this that no report quantifies and no sentence answers for. Between the summer the tape was played and the night in Sheffield when the plates did not match, 18 months passed, and in those 18 months the man the inquiry was looking for did not stop. Barbara Leach was killed in Bradford in the September after the tape. Marguerite Walls was killed the following summer. Jacqueline Hill was killed in Leeds that November, weeks before the arrest. Whether a differently directed inquiry would have reached him sooner is unknowable, and pretending otherwise would be its own dishonesty. What is not unknowable is that the resource was finite, and a great deal of it went northeast. Nor has the motive ever really been explained, which is the part people find hardest to accept. There was no ransom, no ideology, no plan. Humble was not trying to protect anyone and had no connection to anyone involved. The closest thing to an account he gave was that he had been drinking, that he had followed the case obsessively in the papers, and that he had wanted, in some way he could not articulate, to be inside the biggest thing happening in the country. It is a shabby, small explanation for an enormous consequence, and it has the ring of truth precisely because it explains so little. The names that should end this are not the hoaxers and not the killers. 13 women were killed before that arrest in Sheffield, and more were attacked and survived, and for years the public conversation about them was conducted in the language of a manhunt rather than the language of their lives. They were not a series. They were individual people, most of them known to the police only as entries in an inquiry that had grown too large to see them. If there is a practical rule to take from it, it is not about tapes or accents. It is that an inquiry should be able to say at any moment which of its beliefs are load-bearing and what each of them rests on. The Wearside theory was load-bearing, it was actively excluding people, and it rested on a letter writer's apparent knowledge of a killing that may not have belonged to the series, corroborated by a blood grouping shared by millions. Written down like that in one sentence, the weakness is obvious. It was never written down like that. It was distributed across a dozen files and several years, and nobody ever had to see the whole sentence at once. The last thing worth saying about Stanley Ellis is that he never made much of what he had done. He returned to his dialect work, and he continued to give evidence in cases where a voice needed placing, and he lived long enough to see the man he had located identified and convicted. He had been right in public about a small district on the north bank of a river, and being right had helped nobody at all. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is, however, the accurate one, and it is the reason this case is still taught. The science performed exactly as advertised, and the failure happened everywhere else.